Hi, I'm His Lordship, the founder of the Wilderness Guardians. Welcome to episode 2 of Castle Critic. In this series, we examine the defensive capabilities of RuneScape's various castles. We see how well they've been designed and how long they could withstand an oncoming siege. Now, I begin with a caveat to say that I am just an amateur in this field. So I'm prone to making mistakes, and if I do, I would love to hear about them in the comments below, and I'll be sure to rectify those mistakes in future videos. I am here to learn as well. As an amateur, I think I am pretty fairly well equipped to give some insight into castle design. I have visited several dozen castles in my lifetime, and I've read several books on the matter as well. I'm also an avid follower of Shadowversity, the preeminent YouTube channel on castle design. I think we need to begin with 4 assumptions before we look at these castles. The first assumption is that RuneScape's castles were designed to fend off attacks from other humans or human-like creatures. So that would exclude things like dragons and spirits, for the very reason that once we start including magical creatures, castle design would change drastically. The second assumption that we have to make is that NPCs can't teleport, or most of them can't. And the reason for that is once you start including teleportation, where you can shuttle resources in and out of a castle, or NPCs could simply flee by teleporting, then castle design breaks apart. The third assumption that we have to make is that even though there is an abundance of magic in the world of Gelinor, it can't be used to take down castle defenses. Again, if Fire Blast or Ancient Magics could burst holes in walls, then castles would be designed completely differently as well. A final assumption is that cannons are relatively new to the game. I mentioned in the last episode that dwarf cannons are not siege cannons by the way that they rotate. These were meant to attack creatures, not fortifications. The other cannons that we do see in the game, we just have to assume that they're not completely able to take down a wall. In history, it was the improvement of gunpowder weapons that made castles redundant, and they became replaced by what we now know as star forts. Now let's have a look at Varrock Palace. We get one clue in the name Palace. So this was more designed to be a residential building rather than a fortification. A castle is of course both, but a palace privileges the residential aspect of the castle. But that's not to say that Varrock Palace isn't a castle, because it is fairly well defended. Well, it tries to be. I've spotted numerous flaws in it, but it does some things right. So why don't we have a look at this in a bit more detail now?
Varrock Palace is the oldest castle in RuneScape, along with Lumbridge Castle. Both were released on the 4th of January 2001. Now I thought Lumbridge Castle was bad, but good God, Varrock Palace is hideous. Whoever designed it tried really hard to make it look imposing and strong, but failed so badly that I feel embarrassed for them. There's so little they got right. I am going to bend over backwards to give them the kindest possible interpretation of the design. I guess it's best to start with location. As you can see from the map, the castle isn't protected by any natural barriers like rivers or mountains. The entire city of Varrock is on flat land, which means invaders can easily attack from all sides. The city could have been placed either slightly west to benefit from the River Lum, or slightly east to draw from the River Salve. But its founders chose to avoid both rivers, which is so incredibly stupid because in addition to being excellent barriers, they offer a vital source of drinking water for a city's citizens. But this isn't a town planning critique, so let's get past that. Also, there are many real castles built on flatland, such as Muiderslot Castle, but as you can see, where no natural barriers exist, artificial barriers like moats are constructed. Of the many benefits to having elevation right in front of a wall, the most important is how it nerfs siege equipment. Imagine having to use a battering ram uphill against gravity. Ladders are also less stable on inclines, so as you can see, the walls of Varrock face perfectly flat land, which is a real waste. Worse still, they are far too short to be effective. A good medieval wall should be at least 3 times the height of a human, and this is barely twice as high. Many attackers would be able to scale this wall even without ladders. Now, I bet Jagex did this to improve the visibility of the game, but that came at the cost of accuracy. At least they got the wall's thickness correct. A good defensive wall in the Middle Ages would be up to 4 meters thick. A reasonable one would be 2 meters thick, and the absolute thinnest a wall should be is 1 meter, which is enough for soldiers to walk past each other. These crenellations that line the entire wall, they're about half the height they should be. Crenellations are meant to protect your defending archers from incoming fire, and also allow them to peer around the merlons and fire back with relative safety. These ones are better than the Lumbridge ones, but not by much. Now someone tell me, where are the damn gates? This is the most embarrassing thing I could possibly imagine. To have a massive wall around an important city, and then to forget the gates? Now you may be thinking that gates could be installed at short notice, but a good gate is part of the initial build, perfectly sized to fit grooves in the wall and reinforced thoroughly. Any kind of makeshift gate would be significantly weaker and vulnerable to siege damage. On another note, an outer wall for a castle should have clear visibility for archers on the ramparts to fire at distant attackers well before they reach the gate. Around the entire town, the archers would be hindered by trees and other small obstacles here, which enemies could also chop down easily and turn into siege weapons. Even the wilderness-facing side is tree-lined. I guess we can give Jagex a pass here because, who knows, they may have been clearing them regularly, but trees in RuneScape just grow right back. Time to talk about the watchtowers. Why are they not connected to the main wall? Anyone stationed here has just signed a death warrant. If they had just built the tower a few feet back adjacent to the wall, the defenders could do a tactical retreat. Also, why would you build it like this, where soldiers could hide underneath it and avoid the archers above? So stupid. So let's turn to the palace itself. It's completely enclosed by another wall, and as with the city wall, it's been rendered completely ineffective due to a lack of gate, short crenellations, trees growing nearby, and no elevation or ditch. The walls divide the approach to the main building into two sections. There's an outer bailey and an inner bailey. The purpose of these baileys is to funnel attackers where they can be flanked from both sides. And apart from the problems I just listed, each bailey has its own set of unique shortcomings. The outer bailey is actually built on a decline, which is really bad. It gives the attackers the higher ground, and it makes the inner wall shorter than the outer wall, meaning archers on the inner wall can't attack past the outer wall. You can also see some spears sticking out of the ground. Now this is really interesting. These best resemble something called the Cheval de Frise, which is an anti-cavalry defense. Now there are obviously no horses in RuneScape, but I think we have to give the designers the benefit of the doubt here and hope that they were placed there for creatures like hellhounds or wolves. To be honest, I still don't see the point in placing them here, right in front of a wall though. A Cheval de Frise is usually best placed on an open field where cavalry is more likely to charge. Access to the inner bailey shouldn't actually be built right behind the outer bailey gate, by the way. You should really move the inner gate off to the side so that the enemy needs to travel farther, subjecting themselves to increased arrows and spells. Now let's talk about this overhanging entrance to the palace. Jesus wept. When I first saw this, I nearly had a stroke. I could talk for half an hour just about this travesty. So let's begin with the actual design. Now these flimsy columns are holding up a large part of the next floor. That's a lot of weight to be carrying, and a few well-aimed cannon or catapult shots could collapse them and cause the whole front of the palace to crumble. I also know that the floor of the next level is made of wood, because in medieval castles you couldn't use stone for higher floors as it was too heavy. Now imagine what would happen if the enemy lit a fire under this overhang. They could literally cook the palace from the inside out. If I was an attacker, that's exactly what I'd do. Now here's something interesting. See this little lip at the top of the palace that protrudes from the wall? These are machicolations, where archers can fire straight down on attackers through those holes. However, machicolations don't work well if an attacker can run straight past them into the overhanging area. You really want people to be piling up against the side of the wall where they can be picked off from the top. And now, to put the cherry on the stupid cake, someone decided to push the towers back into the building instead of allowing them to protrude. Towers normally stick out of walls and buildings so that defenders can fire down on the sides of the castle. When a tower goes back like this, they have a significantly narrowed field of vision. Anyone in these towers would not be able to fire down at enemies at the palace walls. Fortunately, that's only true of the front. All the other sides have the towers sticking out. The issue I have with the other sides of the palace is the damn windows. They made them so large that people could literally fit through them, and they're on the ground floor. Dear Lord, they couldn't even be bothered to raise them up to higher floors. Now I get it, large windows let light in, but you place those in the middle of the palace. Look, it even has an inner courtyard for those large windows. Outward-facing windows should be small enough so that nobody can enter through them. Now, one thing I can credit this castle with is that there are ample soldiers, as evidenced by the many bunk beds around the place. There are also training areas to make sure those soldiers can sharpen their skills, so the palace has that going for it. I'd hardly call it a palace though. Yes, a king lives there, but given how much space is dedicated to combat and how little is royal residence, it doesn't actually deserve to be called a palace. Now, one other thing, the cannons. In my last video, I explained that cannons are not particularly effective defensive weapons because in order to attack an approaching enemy, you have to blast through your own walls first. But as some viewers pointed out to me, once an enemy has breached your defenses, they're better than nothing. The last thing we need to discuss is the postern gate, or in other words, the rear entrance. Castles typically have these to smuggle in supplies during a siege or to send out small hits on the enemy. They are usually so small and narrow that attackers don't bother with them. A good postern gate needs a long and narrow tunnel so that defenders can bottleneck incoming attackers. Varrock Palace has one door. Knock that down and you're good to go. Admittedly, it's hard to get to. You do have to run around the entire inner bailey to reach it. All in all, I'm giving Varrock Palace 1 star. It's got a decent amount of soldiers to fortify it, but it doesn't really have much else going for it. I suggest King Rold executes whoever designed this palace for him, because he got massively ripped off. This is a fail of epic proportions. Thanks for sticking around, everyone. Next video, we're looking at a palace that many viewers think is a strong contender for the most defensible castle in RuneScape. The third castle to be added to the game, the White Knight's Castle in Falador. Will it really fare much better? Time will tell. Happy scaping, everyone.